So much to get into the NFL. The Eagles, a little slow today with the Eagles news, but right, at the end of the right when we were getting to this time, we see this report out here that it looks like Trey Burton going to be possibly walking. And John, we've talked a little bit about him, but some people think that he's a pretty important guy to try to get back here. But the possibilities of Burton moving on, it seems like he would be a classic overpay kind of guy for another team.
Yeah, that's the perfect example. We've mentioned it before on the show with Trey specifically and also Bo Allen. I think those are the two most likely guys who are backups on this team that are going to get paid like starters from somebody in this league. And if that's the case, the Eagles are not going to be able to match it for a number of reasons. In Trey's specific instance, he's very similar to Zach Ertz, not as a player. Zach's a star, although he's a very good receiver, but they're both receiving tight ends. They both, the weakness of their games is blocking. So it's very difficult to play them together. Trey had a very good stretch when Zach Ertz was injured. There's a reason for that. He's on the field more. As I mentioned, though, when Zach is healthy, you're not taking Zach Ertz off the field. It would be silly. And then in that instance, you really can't afford to play Trey Burton, and therefore you can't afford to pay him. So it's just logical that he would be a guy that's probably going to move on.
For the listeners out there, he's a backup tight end, but number one, what kind of role did he have when Ertz played? And number two, when Ertz didn't play, he really, excelled in his time out there, which will probably get him overpaid. And number three, do we think that there were more ways the Eagles could utilize him even with Ertz on the field?
Well, it's difficult, and that's what I just mentioned. It's great to theorize because you have two guys out there who are matchup problems. But I always say, I mentioned the same thing when people were very, very excited dating back to the preseason with the potential, they called it 21 pony with Terrence Sproles and Donnell Pumphrey being on the field at the same time. I said way back then, I've said it time and time again with their Ertz and Burton, at some point somebody's got to block to make these plays work. So you can't have everybody on the field in skill positions, and none of them are good blockers. And that's the reason why Trey wasn't able to get on the field when Zach was on the field, and why he kind of showed off when Zach was injured. Can you get them on the field together? Well, sure, you can do anything you want, but you're probably going to suffer, as I said, because teams are going to figure out you got two tight ends on the field, and neither of them can block very well.
John, is one of the biggest benefits for the Eagles winning the Super Bowl that grace period that they get from basically the fan base and all the critics out there, or do you think that that doesn't last very long? Because, you come off a world championship and they make some of these coaching moves and these coordinator changes and things like that, and it doesn't seem to, all people gravitate towards is, did you see Jason Kelce talk at spring training or things like that?
Yeah, you get a honeymoon, and you deserve a honeymoon, especially in this town after you get the first one after 52 Super Bowls. Doug's got a shelf life. Howie's got a shelf life now. While I say that, though, in this era, shortest attention spans, everybody's on to the next thing rather quickly. I don't think it's quite as long as it was in the past, when if you got a Super Bowl, you probably had basically a decade or more guaranteed to you. I don't think that's quite the case, but there's no doubt that this group has quite a lengthy rope, especially when you consider it to other teams and other regimes around the league, and rightfully so, deservedly so. So, it's, when you talk about losing coordinators, though, and losing quarterbacks coach and John DeFilippo, look, the Eagles didn't want to lose those guys. They lost them because they got promotions, and they got significant promotions. And the reason why is because they won the Super Bowl. We talk about Super Bowl attrition all the time. It happens to every team that wins the Super Bowl. It's going to happen to the Eagles, and that's why you see this report with Trey Burton. It's going to happen with him. It's going to happen with Bo Allen. That's just the way this league works.
So in that honeymoon period, you've got Jason Kelsey playing baritone sax in a jazz band, and apparently he's got a mummers gig this weekend.
Yeah, Jason's been all over. You know, hey.
Is there anybody enjoying that honeymoon more than Jason Kelsey?
Well, he had a great year. He really did. He was an all-pro. He was the best center in football. And I think a lot of people thought this was going to be his last year in Philadelphia because of the way he played in the previous 2 seasons, which I think it was a little bit overblown. I always said he had bad starts in both of those seasons, but came on and played better late in the season. He was always an above-average center. But he was not playing like a Pro Bowl center, which he was earlier in his career. And all of a sudden, for whatever reason, it went back in the other direction, and he played his best football ever. He had never, even when he was playing at a high level before, he was never an all-pro center. He was never the best center in football. He was the best center in football, and you can make an argument he was the best offensive lineman in football. And that kind of spawned the famous speech now when everybody talking about, you know, the entire team and nobody believed in him, which I think is, as I said on the show, I think it was incorrect, but nonetheless, that's how this team took it, and they used it as fuel, and it obviously worked.
It's the whole team.
That's right. We're from Philly. We're from Philly, but I won't sing the song. So I guess the first step, John, or the next step then is the combine in Indianapolis. This is going to be a whole new thing for the Eagles to go out to that combine and go out as Super Bowl champs. I mean, they know they're the 32nd and last pick in the first round. They're going to get a lot of backslaps and handshakes and things. It's a different feeling for them.
Yeah, but this is
going
where
out there.
I bet you this is the kind of challenge that Howie likes, is being 32nd and trying to figure out a way to move himself up the ledger.
Well, I would think the opposite, actually, because they don't have a second and third round pick. So unless
even more reason for him to work some magic. I don't have a second and a third. I'm picking 32nd. Mwah, watch me move.
Yeah, he might move, but I think more likely is what I was saying is he'd probably move backward to pick up more picks. Now, that could all change if they trade Nick Foles, if they're able to get a first-round pick for him. So there's a lot of dominoes to fall before the draft. There is free agency. The Eagles have a lot of work to do because they're going to be about $9 million over the cap. They have players to deal with, as you mentioned, not only as far as free agents, but also potential restructures to create some room from that standpoint. So there's a lot going on before the draft. But anytime you're picking 32, I say it all the time, need is the worst talent evaluator in sports. The good for the Eagles is they're a very deep team to begin with. They don't have a ton of needs. But anytime you're 32, you're best off just picking the best player that's there.
Yeah, John, you say
and sort of let it fall where it may.
Sorry, buddy, didn't mean to cut you off there. You say they don't have a lot of needs, but maybe the closest thing they have to a dire situation is linebacker, right? That may be something they want to address.
Well, it's not even necessarily there if you get Nigel Bradham done. Again, it depends on free agency. If Nigel's back and Jordan Hicks will be back from his Achilles injury, you would imagine they can't pay Michael Kendricks and Nigel Bradham. So there's a potential spinoff of a trade for Michael Kendricks. But, yeah, they could use some depth, even if they bring Bradham back. And that was the case this year, when you saw Joe Walker sort of not being able to fit in as even a sub-package player. They had to go out and sign Daniel Ellerbe late in the season. You could always use some depth, but when you're talking about a sub-package linebacker is your biggest need, hey, there's 31 other teams envious of that, because usually you got far bigger needs than that.
Yeah, now we know one guy they did draft last year who never played was their second-round pick, Sidney Jones. And I guess he'll be an interesting story to watch, in camp and everything, to see how they view him. You know what I mean? Like, do they view him as in year one, let's work him in? Does he get the starting spot right away? I mean, how high the organization has to be on high on him to take a flyer on him when they did, knowing that he probably wasn't going to play.
Yeah, I mean, I think the whole league is high on him as far as a talent perspective. I mean, he's a top 15 level talent. So always, if he's healthy and he's completely back from the injury, and there's no reason to think he won't be, yeah, I mean, the Eagles want to see him and want to see that talent on the field. He would be given every opportunity to win a starting job, because as well as the Eagles corners played at times this year, and I think they all overachieved from what we thought they were going to be, none of them have the talent, the raw talent of Sidney Jones. So, if you could imagine having a Patrick Peterson type or a Xavier Rhodes type or a Jalen Ramsey type, that's your hope, is that you have a true lockdown corner. And he's got that type of talent to have that type of ceiling as a player. Not saying he's ever going to be those guys, because there's more to it than just having physical gifts. But you certainly want to see that guy and see what he can do, and you hope he gets on the field as soon as possible as a starter.
A couple guys I want to throw your way, John, as we're going to start getting into that time of the year where you're going to start to see official free agency begin on March the 14th. So we're just 2 weeks away. In fact, March 14th is, less than 2 weeks away? What are we at, 23rd? So about 2.5 weeks away. This thing's going to be here before we know it, and you're going to start to see cuts, trades, all sorts of stuff. So let me just throw a couple names your way and see if they think they'll be back next year. Torrey Smith.
No. He's got a $5 million option, and as I said, the Eagles are $9 million over projected to be a little bit. It's about $9.4 million over the cap, so they have to create some space. So you have to look at obvious ways they can do that. That's a very easy way. There's no dead money in Torrey Smith's contract. It was essentially set up as a one-year deal plus 2 team options, so they can easily get out of it. And he just didn't play well during the regular season. Played better in the playoffs.
Mm-hmm. He played pretty good in the playoffs.
Guy. Yeah, a great locker room guy. You'd like to have him around from that perspective, but you got to make some tough decisions, and that's one of them. And you have a young receiver in Mac Hollins that's going in a positive direction, and you could probably pick up a younger veteran who maybe can give you some of that deep threat that would be a little bit more consistent catching the football. You got to be very careful when you talk about giving up on leaders in the locker room, but the Eagles did it a number of times last season, and they've proven, Howie Roseman, Joe Douglas, they've proven they can make those difficult decisions. That's a pretty obvious one to me.
Okay, your take on Brent Selleck's future? Cut, trade it, retire? What happens with him?
Well, I think a lot of people are sort of thinking he may retire at his age, 32, winning the Super Bowl. It's great to go back on top. The Eagles could save $4 million by cutting him if he doesn't retire. I think from the Eagles' preference, they would almost hope he retires because they don't want to have to cut him. If he does come back, and remember, he's the only Eagles tight end that can block. So he's still got a role on this team if they still think he can do it. But it would have to be with a restructured deal. Otherwise, they're going to have to move on for the same reason. It's a salary cap issue.
Then you got, Vinny Curry, who played well, but he gets paid a lot. I don't know if there's a trade market for him, but Vinny Curry back or someplace else?
Well, the only way he could be back is on a restructured deal. He can't come back at the number he's scheduled to get, which is $9 million. That would be more than Brandon Graham. Obviously more than Derek Barnett. Derek Barnett's going to be the starter next year, so he's going to sort of move into a potential backup role, and you just can't pay backups that much money. That's the reality. They'd love to trade him, and I think there will be a bigger market for Vinny Curry than you might think because he is a good pass rusher, and there are teams in this league desperate for pass rushers. And if he is a full-time player, the number is not that bad. It's just bad in this situation because the other defensive end makes less than Vinny, and he's a lot better. And then you have Derek Barnett, who's coming and is expected to be the starter. So that contract is just not tenable for the Eagles right now.
John, how about a guy like Michael Kendricks? Cut, or do you think there's a trade market for him? Can the Eagles even afford to trade Michael Kendricks?
Well, they can afford to trade him if they re-sign Nigel Bradham. And I think they almost have to trade him if they do sign Nigel Bradham. You can't pay a third linebacker in this league as it's set up today. Remember, there's only two linebackers that play because you're in nickel basically 65 to 70% of the time. So the third linebacker is a sub-package player. And obviously if Jordan Hicks is back and Nigel's back, Michael Kendricks is going to bandy back to that role as the third linebacker where he only plays 25% of snaps a game. You can't play similar to Vinny Curry. You can't pay a backup that much money. So a lot depends on if they're able to re-sign Nigel Bradham. But Michael did play well enough this season that there might be a bigger trade market because he's proven that he can be a successful starting linebacker in this league again. He's just not as good as Nigel Bradham or Jordan Hicks.
John McMullen on with us, our 97.3 ESPN Eagles Insiders. We talk Eagles offseason moves. How about on the line, a guy like Chance Warmack, John? That's a guy they gave an extension to, but then he kind of barely played after sort of becoming a starter or getting starter money.
Yeah, that's an interesting one. He doesn't make a lot of money, so they could bring him back. But you always want to go a little bit younger, a little bit cheaper as far as depth. He is a Jeff Stoutland favorite back to when they were winning national championships together at Alabama. So I think I think Jeff sees more out of him than the rest of us do. He's been a huge disappointment. I remember when he came out, he was, I think, the 10th, maybe 10th or 11th overall pick in Tennessee as an offensive guard. That's rare that guards get picked that high. A lot of people thought he was the best player in the draft, and he just never panned out in Tennessee. Was given the opportunity to win that starting left guard spot after Isaac Seumalo faltered. He did not play well, and that's when Stefan Wisniewski finally got his chance and locked down that spot. So the problem with Chance is if you're a backup offensive lineman, you almost have to have versatility in this league because you can only dress 7 on game day, basically, and that means you have to have an interior backup and a swing tackle. And the interior backup generally is able to play all three positions. Chance is only a guard, so that hurts him. Now, you can kind of get around that because Wisniewski can play center. So if, for instance, Jason Kelsey went down in the game, you can move Wisniewski to center and put Warmack in at left guard. But I think the Eagles would prefer a more versatile player if he's not going to win the starting job.
Now, John, you know I always focus on the kickers and the kicking game a little bit. Let's talk about Donnie Jones, the punter. He's 38, but he makes some pretty good money for a punter.
Yeah, that's how it works. I mean, if you're around as long as Donnie Jones, you make a lot of money for that particular position. So you're always kind of looking over your shoulder at a potential salary cap hit, even though he's still very, very effective. The Eagles re-signed Cameron Johnson. They had him last year in the offseason throughout training camp. They think a lot of him. And that's an easy way to save some money. So I think a lot of it has to do with how much Cameron Johnson has improved. If he shows in the off-season work, because Donnie generally stays away from the voluntary work, he generally goes home. If he opens up some eyes, that could be one of those low-key potential changes just to save a little bit of money.
Talk with John McMullen. The Eagles offseason free agency begins in just about 2.5 weeks from now. What about Peters? He's an interesting one because Peterson did say he wants him back, but he makes some decent coin.
Yeah, he does. It's not quite as much as people think. When you look at other left tackles in this league, that's a position that gets paid very, very highly. So it's sort of built in that you understand you're going to pay your left tackle. I think more of it has to do with the 36-year-old guy who's coming off a very serious injury. And he's had injuries in the past, remember, with the Achilles. At some point, Father Time's got to catch up to him. So I think the bigger concern is, has that started already at 36 years old? And then you add in the fact that Halafula Vati Vaitai, I love saying that, but he got slowly and incrementally better as the season wore on. And by the time the playoffs got here, he was not a deficiency by any stretch of the imagination. He certainly wasn't a Pro Bowl level player, but he proved he can play in this league. And you have to think about the future. And if they think Vaitai is a potential starter for the future, that's another option they could have moving on to garner some salary cap money. But there is not a big – we talk about leaders. We talked about Torrey Smith. Jason Peters is the guy in that locker room. I mean, the guy. So much respect, not only from the coaching staff but the players. That's a tough guy to move on from.
That one's one to keep an eye on. John McMullen's with us here. Big trade in the NFL today. Adam Schefter reporting the Chiefs and Rams are in the final stages of talks that will send Marcus Peters to the Rams. That impacts the Eagles because the Rams are a legitimate, Super Bowl contender. You add Marcus Peters to that team on that defensive side of the ball. That's pretty good. The deal's expected to be agreed upon as early as sometime today, and I think it is actually official now. And, you look at what the Rams are doing now. They added a pretty high-level player. So this shows teams are coming after you. They're trying to, add players. But getting Marcus Peters, I don't know what happened with him in Kansas City because that's a heck of a player.
Yeah, I mean, tremendously talented guy. He's had some issues dating back to college off the field. He was suspended for one game. He's also kind of handsy. There's probably not a bigger playmaker in the league as far as making plays, but he also gets a ton of penalties because he's very, very physical. So you have to add that into it. And that's one of those things you sort of have to figure out in the move from college to the pros, because they let you play more at the college level from a physical standpoint. And when we talked in the past in this conversation, I mentioned names like Peterson and Ramsey and Rhodes. Peters would be in that group if he could just figure out how to cut down the penalties. To this point, he hasn't. But from a talent standpoint, I mean, he's as good as it gets. The issues with the coaching staff in Kansas City, as I said, suspended for a game, that all adds into it. But that Rams defense, from a talent perspective, they're just really, really good. And, Wade Phillips runs it. So the Rams look like they're going to be good for a significant period of time and could turn into sort of that rival of the Eagles at the top of the NFC.
A lot of teams going to have makeovers trying to now. What do teams do in the offseason, guys? They try to find a way to take down the Super Bowl champions. They do things to combat what the champions do. The Rams have struck. The Redskins look like they're going to change quarterbacks. Should be a very interesting offseason to see what teams do to try to come after the Eagles. John McMullen at JF McMullen on Twitter. Follow him there. And, of course, every day right here on the Sports Bash Live on 97.3 ESPN. He, like all guests, appeared via the Boardwalk Honda hotline. Thanks, pal.
Thank you, guys.